Hello, everyone. My name is Alistair Dutton. As you say, I'm chair for the Global Offshore Wind Task Force, but also lead consultant for the World Bank, who have an offshore wind program, which we'll mention as we go. A little bit about my background: 15 years at BP, then 7 years at the Crown Estate in the UK, leading the UK offshore wind program. And the UK is still just the largest market in the world, but China will go past us in the next few years. And then in the last 3 years, I've focused specifically on taking offshore wind global, and in that time provided advice to now 29 different countries. Maybe we could have the next slide. So why offshore wind? Well, basically because there's a lot of it. This is a map taken from the Global Wind Atlas, which is available free online, funded by the World Bank. And you can see that the red and slightly purple areas are very high wind speeds, going down to the greens and blues that aren't. But essentially, there's a lot of wind available in Asia. And you'll notice that the wind speed is so much stronger offshore than it is onshore, since the power you get from wind power is related to the cube of the wind speed. Just a small increase is helpful, but this is a massive increase. But you'll also notice there's some places where there isn't much wind, and around the equator, that's the case. So fortunately, sufficient for Asia. Next slide, please. I'm just going to mention briefly the comparison between oil and gas and offshore wind. Oil and gas has sadly been suffering over the last few years. So this is the forward price to earnings ratio, whereas Ørsted, who are currently the largest developer in offshore wind, their fortunes have been going hugely up. And the next slide brings another point to it. It used to be that the returns in oil and gas were very interesting, in double digits, maybe even higher. Now, the latest analysis is showing that renewable energy actually has a higher return on investment than oil and gas, particularly in new developments. So, some of the reasons why we'll go through. Next slide, please. Li Ming kind of shared this graph. I would merely say, thing I would add is, whilst offshore wind is now 10% of the installations, in terms of investment, because offshore wind is more expensive per megawatt, it's closer to 20% of the market. It really has come of age. Next slide, please. And the costs have fallen dramatically. Li Ming mentioned all of this, but there's still space for further cost reduction. So offshore wind is not done yet in that respect. Next slide. I'll try and concentrate on the things you haven't been told. The thing that surprises a number of people is it's not just low cost power, but also that the capacity factor is much higher than other renewable energies. So depending on your geography, you might get 10 to 25% from solar PV, obviously not much overnight. From wind, you might be in 30 to 35% capacity factor. Offshore wind's now at 50%. And the International Energy Agency has used the phrase variable baseload because it's there for so much of the time. Then clearly it's a resource that is owned by the country, which is very appealing. Many people want to reduce their import of fossil fuels. But the thing that we've found that the governments particularly like is that they can grow the economic benefits. The inward investment, some of it, yes, is regulated, as Hans has mentioned, but just simple market dynamics. So UK does not regulate the amount of local content, but has seen huge amounts of inward investment, as has Germany, Denmark, places like that. And it's not just in the wind farms, it's very much in the supply chain and ports, which have benefited from the scale of what's required. And then that brings with it thousands and thousands of jobs. which politically is very interesting, both in the direct offshore wind market, but also in the wider. So I've spoken to people, and taxi drivers are are benefiting. Hotels are benefiting. Local shops are benefiting. It's got so much economic benefit, and very deep into the country. It's not just at the coast. Also, we've seen over 50 projects taken through to development. That's particularly in the UK. Only 2 of those has failed to get their consent. That's incredibly low risk compared to other developments. And because it's so far from shore, it's not visible in many projects, and the politicians love all of those combinations. So it's very appealing for governments to try to bring it on as well. And then it's benign in so many ways compared to fossil fuels, obviously carbon footprint and beyond. So those multiple benefits, as well as the dropping power price, make this very, very appealing. Next slide, please. At World Bank, we've just completed what's called a roadmap study, which has taken, I think, about 8 months to pull together, and looks at the full breadth of the issues to do with offshore wind, and then in some considerable depth. And this map again comes from the Global Wind Atlas, and it shows areas which are with lines or stripes. Those would be suitable for fixed foundations, and the areas with dots, those would be suitable for floating foundations. And there's a real sweet spot to the southeast of Vietnam, as Hans mentioned. And then the summary graphic from the report is the process that we would advise the Vietnamese government to go through in terms of setting visions and targets, and there are numbers in this report, and then the regulatory processes which have been done elsewhere. And just to pop to Taiwan, one of the reasons that Taiwan has been so successful is their government are great listeners. They came to the UK. I remember meeting with them about 8 years ago. I gave them copies of the leasing contracts that we used, and they've pretty much been adopted in Taiwan. So they've learned very much from European, but they've then adapted it to their own circumstances. So this can be put together quite quickly. And then, yes, there does need to be investment in infrastructure. So a report on that was published last week and is open for consultation. Can I have the next slide, please? A few things to appreciate about offshore wind. Some governments think they can take their onshore wind policy and adapt it quickly to offshore wind. Sadly, that doesn't work. For those of you that work in oil and gas, which I believe are many on the call, it is a complex project, much more akin to oil and gas contracts and structures. But it's still different because the turbines are more than a kilometre apart. So if you've got 100 turbines, you've got a massive area that not only you're trying to construct in, but to operate in. The number of vessels involved in a project, typically around 60 vessels through the sort of life of the wind farm. So that needs incredibly good marine logistics. Health and safety is a challenge when you're working at this area with people so spread out. Then the other thing to bear in mind is the size and the weight of the components. So the substation's not dissimilar to a topside for oil and gas, but the turbines, the towers were now, what, 120 meters high. The blades, they're more than 100 meters long. The heaviest component in an offshore wind farm is actually the export cable, which may be as high as sort of 4,500 tons. They take real skill to install without causing damage to the cables themselves. So, and then the investment scale is so much larger than you would see with onshore wind. Next slide, please. But oil and gas companies have been in the sector for some time, particularly Equinor and Shell. They've learnt the industry, and one of the big differences is that the power market is very different to the oil and gas market. So historically lower returns, as I mentioned, but also different variabilities to it. Won't go into the depth of it here. And now we're seeing some companies who've been in and then out, but are now back in fully, and latest being BP, which I'm pleased to see. And then the supply chain. So I was talking with the supply chain in Aberdeen, and about half of them, maybe a bit more, have already experienced offshore wind, and certainly want to do more because their experience in oil and gas is suffering. This is a report from earlier this year, and you can see a lot of people are at least planning to be in offshore wind because it's so akin to what they've already done. Next slide, please. There was some interest in floating wind, and this is GWEC's projection for the floating wind market. I would just be careful. Floating wind hasn't got to commercial scale yet, so we don't yet know particularly what the costs will be and how fast they will come down. So our projection is that it will happen back end of this decade, but it may take into next decade to get really competitive with fixed foundations. But in countries that have deep waters, as have been mentioned, it's really the thing that they're concentrating on. And oil and gas companies particularly are concentrating on floating because they think their skill set fits that as a competitive advantage. And by going to floating, we actually treble the size of the market from fixed foundations, because further from shore, you have deeper waters generally, but also places like west coast of the US. Again, floating's the thing to do, but they're passionate on renewable energy. So we can see these dynamics around the world all playing into the advantage of Asia. There was a question about how large floating is compared to fixed foundations as a market. And at the end of this decade, that would be 6% of the wider offshore wind market. So interesting, but it's next decade where it really scales up. The other topic, next slide, please, which becomes really fascinating is, okay, power to X, or most people will talk about hydrogen generation. But it could also be ammonia or desalination. There's a number of different ways you can use that amount of power. And I won't go through the whole schematic here, but what this brings is, to date, we've had to, in offshore wind, find a power demand, find a grid connection, find wind nearby. That won't be necessary when we go to hydrogen. So my view is that all of a sudden the projects will go to the very best wind resource in the world, generate hydrogen, and that can be shipped to where the demand is. That is a huge step up in the market. At the moment, not economic, but you can see as onshore wind dropped in prices, PV dropped in prices, offshore wind, storage, the next along the way will be hydrogen. We're confident of that. Next slide, please. But there are challenges. So to me, it's a rosy picture, but you have to be very careful. Health and safety culture, well understood in oil and gas, not so well understood in wind. And of course, offshore wind presents even more challenges. The systems are one thing, it's the individuals and the behaviors, which is much more challenging. Won't go through it, but I would say the best projects, i.e. best in terms of financial return, also demonstrate the best health and safety report because they get things right first time. Lots of regulations to consider. The big thing for when you're talking about power, so the offtake power, is regulations. In some countries, there's curtailment, i.e. they can tell you they're not going to take your power. Some counterparty risk, i.e. the power company is not very creditworthy. And then where there are support mechanisms, they will run for maybe 15 or 20 years. So after that, you have what's called merchant power. and there's a risk involved in that. Mention's been mentioned of local content. The auctions themselves, developers have to put a lot of money in. We're talking maybe 30, 40 million pounds before they can get to the auction in certain markets. So that can be tricky. But we have seen those projects still tend to come through, maybe not first auction, but second. Obviously, construction risk, that's sort of quite obvious in terms of you can see what you're going to deal with, but some companies haven't fully understood the weather risk, particularly as you go further from shore. And then I think particularly high for the people listening is understanding the interface risk. So there have been projects that have tried to use a full EPC wrap. Sadly, they suffered. So even big EPC companies in oil and gas have made their mistakes. So what you see now is typically 5 or 6 contracts being let by the developer investor. In the case of one company, it's actually 45, I think was the last number I saw, because they like managing the interface risk and the profit that's embedded in that. But for people in the supply chain, please be really careful how it interfaces, because it's not the same as oil and gas. The contracts are not the same. They come more from the power sector. Operating risk is fairly straightforward, you can imagine. Okay, in the interest of time, I'll move swiftly through the next slides. You've seen this slide, but the thing to point out is, $500 billion to spend this year, 3 trillion by 2050. That's a market to be reckoned with. And the next slide. And Asia is actually a hotspot. So it may be Europe is where the sector's been born, but Asia is the place that it's going. US will come in a bit later this decade. Latin America, probably a bit more next decade as we go fully global. But to have an opportunity of securing 250 billion worth of contracts this decade should interest a lot of people, and in the multiple countries that you've got there. Last slide. And thank you very much for listening. In the intro, I've tried to speed up a little because you needed some more time back. If people have got any questions, feel free to contact us. Have a look at the Global Offshore Wind Report. Thank you very much.